You probably think you know Henry VIII, the big guy with 6 wives, the king who broke from Rome and founded the Church of England, the historical figure reduced to a few textbook bullet points and a portrait of a man in a fancy hat. Well, buckle up. Because the real Henry VIII wasn't just a larger-than-life monarch, he was, in many ways, a walking medieval horror story. The truth about England's most infamous king is so disturbing, so grotesque, that Game of Thrones looks like a bedtime story in comparison. We're talking about a man so massive he needed custom-built mechanical devices just to move around. A man whose legs were so ravaged by festering wounds that the stench alone could clear a room. A ruler so paranoid that he transformed his court into a medieval surveillance state, where spies spied on spies and even his children weren't safe from suspicion. And when death finally came for him, it didn't bring peace. Henry's corpse caused chaos so vile that it shocked even the hardened attendants of the Tudor court and left a mark on English history that no sanitized school version dares to tell. Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the Tudor propaganda machine. We'll explore his grotesque decline, the psychological warfare he inflicted on his wives, the bizarre eating rituals that would put modern competitive eaters to shame, and the kind of paranoia that could freeze an entire empire in fear. But before we get there, let's start with the most shocking truth of all. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was, quite literally, a walking corpse. The king who rot in his own lifetime. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, he was the golden boy of Europe, tall, athletic, charming, and handsome. But the man who would die in 1547 was almost unrecognizable. His waist ballooned to an astonishing 54 inches, bigger than the height of some of his servants. He weighed around 400 pounds in an era when the average man barely tipped the scales at 140. And it wasn't just the size, his body had become a battlefield. His legs were covered in enormous open ulcers, raw, pus-filled craters of flesh that never healed. They wept constantly, staining his clothes and filling the air with a smell so unbearable that courtiers would press perfumed cloths to their faces just to approach him. It wasn't the kind of smell you could ignore. Accounts say it carried through corridors, lingering like a ghost. Dressing the king became a form of punishment. Servants literally drew straws to see who'd be forced to get close enough to lace his boots or fasten his robes. And the cause? Modern medical experts suspect a combination of factors: a traumatic brain injury from a 1536 jousting accident, a condition like Cushing's syndrome, possibly untreated diabetes, all working together to break down his body from the inside out. That jousting accident, by the way, wasn't minor. He was unconscious for 2 hours. In 16th century terms, that was a brush with death. When he woke, something had changed. His temper grew volcanic. His paranoia deepened. His once generous personality soured into cruelty. A prisoner of his own flesh. In his final years, Henry's physical decay became impossible to ignore. The ulcers on his legs grew so bad that even walking a few steps was agony. His joints swelled. His breathing became labored. He needed specially made chairs to carry him through the palace. And yet, he ate like a man trying to set a record. We'll get to that in detail later, but it's worth noting here, the very habits that were killing him, he doubled down on. Mountains of meat, rivers of wine, sugary pastries. There was no royal physician brave enough to suggest otherwise, because in Henry's court, implying that the king was ill was tantamount to treason. The reality was darker still. By the end, he could barely control his bowels. Servants were forced to carry close stools with him everywhere, a portable toilet disguised as a chair, so that when nature called, he didn't have to attempt the long, painful walk to a privy. And remember, this wasn't just a man. This was the man, the ruler of England. A monarch who demanded absolute obedience, yet couldn't even control his own body. The wives who paid the price. Of course, Henry's personal misery didn't mean mercy for those closest to him, especially his wives. Everyone knows the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the rhyme sanitizes the truth. What those women endured wasn't just a string of broken marriages. It was calculated humiliation, emotional abuse, and in some cases, psychological torture. Take Anne Boleyn. Henry didn't simply decide to execute her, he orchestrated a show trial worthy of the most twisted political drama. He had her accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, relying on confessions extracted under torture. Her own musician was forced to admit to an affair that never happened. Her brother was executed alongside 4 other men, all allegedly her lovers, and she was made to watch them die, knowing she would follow them to the scaffold. Then there was Catherine Howard, barely more than a teenager when Henry married her. When he discovered she had been intimate with other men before their marriage, he was so enraged he passed a new law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history. She was executed at 19. Even the lucky ones weren't truly free. Anne of Cleves agreed to have her marriage annulled on the absurd grounds that it had never been consummated. She was so terrified of Henry's wrath that she thanked him for sparing her life. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, spent her final years in isolation, banned from seeing her daughter Mary, while Henry spread rumors that she was mentally unfit. She died alone, possibly poisoned, still signing letters as Queen of England to a husband who would never read them. Jane Seymour, the one Henry called his true wife, died from complications after giving birth to his long-awaited son. Henry's mourning period lasted all of 9 days before he began looking for her replacement. For Henry VIII, women, queen or commoner, were expendable. They were pawns in his dynastic game, and when they no longer served a purpose, they were discarded or destroyed. A court on edge. The stench of Henry's wounds wasn't the only thing poisoning the air in the Tudor court. His paranoia was infectious. In Henry's world, no one was safe. Not wives, not friends, not family. But we'll get into that a little later. First, you need to understand just how unhinged his daily life became, starting with the bizarre, gluttonous rituals that passed for meals in the palace of England's most infamous king. By the time Henry VIII reached the later years of his reign, his body was in revolt. But you wouldn't have guessed it from looking at his table. If gluttony was an Olympic sport, Henry would have been crowned champion every single day. Modern nutritionists say an active man should eat around 2,500 calories per day. Henry? He was packing away at least 5,000 calories daily, sometimes much more. And this wasn't the diet of a man trying to heal festering leg ulcers or manage chronic illness. This was a medieval bacchanal, meat, sugar, and alcohol in endless supply. Imagine an entire feast prepared just for one man 3 times a day. Whole roasted pigs, multiple chickens, several varieties of fish, mountains of fresh bread, pies stuffed with venison or rabbit, wheels of cheese, flagons of ale, and enough wine to drown a small regiment. And then desserts, sugared fruits, tarts, puddings, and cakes made with rare imported spices. This wasn't just eating, this was theatre. The ritual of the royal meal, Henry's meals were staged like a performance in front of the court. He'd sit at an elaborate table under a canopy while servants, some of them nobles themselves, presented each dish with ceremony. But before anything touched his lips, it went through a gauntlet of security. Every bite was tasted by multiple food tasters, each waiting half an hour to make sure they didn't drop dead from poison. Spices, salt, even water were tested by different people to avoid any conspiracy to kill the king. And still, Henry wasn't convinced. Sometimes he refused food entirely if he didn't like the look of a servant's face. At other times, he would demand a dish be prepared in his private kitchens, sealed and guarded, before allowing it into the dining hall. Meals could stretch on for hours. Courtiers sat there, watching this enormous ulcer-ridden monarch slowly work his way through enough food to feed a village, while musicians played and jesters tried to keep the mood light. The irony? Many of the people in that hall were terrified to speak or laugh too freely, because Henry's paranoia meant one wrong glance could get you exiled, or worse. The king's superfoods. Today we roll our eyes at fad diets and so-called superfoods. But Henry had his own bizarre medieval version of this obsession. He believed that eating swan would make him graceful, that venison would sharpen his hunting skills, that oysters would enhance his performance with his wives. He gorged himself on these foods, convinced they imbued him with almost magical qualities. Of course, the reality was the opposite. His diet worsened his health, inflamed his ulcers, and contributed to the crippling gout that left him unable to walk unaided. But in Henry's mind, he was feeding his strength and authority. Food for the few, hunger for the many. While Henry was feasting like this, England was experiencing periodic food shortages. Grain prices spiked, harvests failed. Ordinary people often went hungry. But in Henry's court, certain foods weren't just abundant. They were legally reserved for royalty. He banned commoners' food from his table, not because it was unhealthy, but because it was beneath his royal dignity. Turnips, barley, and coarse bread were outlawed in the royal kitchens. Instead, the focus was on exotic meats, refined sugar, and rare spices imported from across the world. Luxuries that cost fortunes. The hypocrisy didn't matter to Henry. He was the king. If his subjects starved, that was simply the way of the world. Feeding Paranoia, Henry's eating rituals weren't just about indulgence. They were an extension of his growing paranoia. Poison was a constant fear, so much so that preparing his meals became a military operation. Guards were stationed at kitchen doors, seals were placed on pantry cupboards, every cook and server was monitored. And this fear bled into every part of his life. The fortress king, by his final decade on the throne, Henry VIII was living inside a kingdom-sized panic room. The same man who once rode into battle now slept surrounded by loaded crossbows, daggers under his pillow, and armed guards stationed in his bedchamber. But even that wasn't enough. He had secret passages constructed in every palace, hidden routes he could take if assassins came for him. These weren't charming, romantic corridors like in a fairy tale. They were escape tunnels, often cramped and unlit, known only to a handful of trusted attendants. And in Henry's mind, no one was above suspicion. Spies spying on spies, Henry created a network of informants so twisted that it could only exist under a ruler consumed by fear. He had spies monitoring the court, and other spies monitoring them. Friends betrayed friends, servants reported on their masters, and no one knew who to trust. Even his daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, were watched. They were children, yet Henry had agents following their movements, convinced they might one day overthrow him. Paranoia also warped his justice system. He began ordering executions for crimes people might commit. Dreams, rumors, or vague accusations could be enough to seal someone's fate. The Tower of London filled with prisoners whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time when Henry's temper flared. A caught-in-fear life in Henry's court was like living in a constant nightmare. Every conversation could be overheard. Every gesture could be misinterpreted. Even showing too much sadness or joy could be dangerous if Henry thought it hinted at disloyalty. His paranoia even infected the nobles. People began spying on one another in hopes of currying royal favor. Old friendships dissolved, marriages crumbled. The court became a snake pit where everyone feared being the next target. And yet, amid all this suspicion and fear, the king continued his marathon feasts, convinced that his carefully guarded meals made him untouchable. The final act approaches. By 1546, Henry's body was failing fast. He could barely stand. The smell of infection clung to him like a shroud. His temper was worse than ever, but he refused to accept his own mortality. Plans for fortifications, palaces, and banquets continued as though he'd rule for decades to come. He ordered new ships for the navy. He discussed marriage alliances for his children. He even had his armorers adjust his plate armor to fit his enormous bulk. Despite not having worn it in years, those closest to him could see it. The king was dying. But no one dared say it aloud. The royal physicians knew that even a hint of the truth could cost them their heads. When death finally came in January 1547, it wasn't a dignified royal passing. It was the grotesque finale of a life consumed by indulgence, suspicion, and decay. And as you'll see in the next part, Henry's death was every bit as chaotic and revolting as his life. By January 1547, Henry VIII was a man in name only. The once vibrant, athletic prince had become a prisoner inside a bloated, failing body. His final weeks were a grim parade of pain, infection, and humiliation. He could no longer walk on his own. Every movement required a specially designed chair outfitted with pulleys and wheels, pushed and pulled by attendants who dreaded the task. The ulcers on his legs had grown so severe that they constantly dripped pus and blood. Pieces of necrotic flesh would fall away as servants lifted or shifted him, forcing others to follow behind with cloths to clean the palace floors. The smell of rotting tissue was so overpowering that even hardened Tudor courtiers, men and women accustomed to medieval filth, could barely stand to be in the same room with him. And yet, even in this state, the king clung to the image of supreme authority. His word remained law. He still barked orders from his bed. He still demanded feasts, even when he could only eat small amounts at a time. And most of all, he refused to acknowledge that death was closing. In the final hours, accounts of Henry's death vary, but one detail is consistent. He was enormous, swollen, and in constant agony. His skin stretched tight over his frame, shiny from the pressure of his own weight. The ulcers on his legs had worsened to the point where they were possibly gangrenous. His doctors, terrified of offending him, avoided saying the word dying. Even at the end, no one dared to give him last rites until it was absolutely certain he could not protest. In Tudor England, telling a monarch he was near death without permission could be considered treason. It's said that Henry's confessor, Archbishop Cranmer, arrived too late to hear any final words. By the time he was brought to the king's bedside, Henry could only squeeze his hand in acknowledgement. Shortly after, the King of England slipped away. A corpse too large for a coffin death should have ended Henry's reign of terror, but the grotesque reality of his body ensured that even his funeral would be a nightmare. First, there was the problem of the size. Henry's enormous frame required an oversized coffin, reinforced with lead to contain the smell and the fluids from his decaying body. His attendants wrapped him in lead sheets and sealed him in multiple wooden boxes, hoping to delay decomposition long enough for the funeral procession to reach Windsor Castle. It didn't work. The exploding coffin. As the funeral cortege made its way from London to Windsor, the inevitable happened. The gases building inside Henry's body from internal decomposition had nowhere to go, until the pressure burst through the lead lining. Somewhere along the route, Henry VIII's coffin literally exploded. The force split open the casing, releasing the smell of putrefaction into the winter air. According to one account, liquid from his body leaked out onto the road. In a scene almost too macabre to believe, dogs were seen licking the remains. For those present, it was both horrifying and symbolic. The mighty monarch reduced to carrion for strays. Whether or not later chroniclers exaggerated the more graphic details, the fact remains. The journey to his final resting place was marked by chaos, disgust, and deep unease. Trouble at the grave. When the coffin finally reached Windsor, a new problem emerged. The ground itself couldn't hold him. The lead-lined coffin was so heavy that the soil collapsed more than once during the burial attempt. Gravediggers had to widen and reinforce the pit before lowering him into place. Even then, there were rumors that noises and smells emanated from the tomb for days afterward, likely just the continued escape of gases from the decomposing body, but unsettling enough to feed legends of a cursed king. Some whispered that it was Henry's ghost protesting his burial, while others believed it was divine punishment for his cruelty. After all, here was a man who claimed divine right to rule, yet ended his days swollen, rotting, and, despised, death's aftermath. Handling Henry's body wasn't just unpleasant, it may have been lethal. Several attendants who had contact with his corpse reportedly died within weeks, possibly from infections caught during the process. In an age before germ theory, no one knew exactly why, but the connection was noted and feared. In the months after his burial, England was left in political instability. Henry's 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne. But the real power fell to regents and factions already scheming during Henry's last years. His paranoid style of rule left the court fractured, distrustful, and prone to backstabbing. The shadow of his reign loomed over the kingdom, even in death. The legacy of a monstrous reign. Henry VIII's life is often reduced to catchy rhymes and portraits. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the reality was a story of power corrupting absolutely. He was a man who turned his body into a prison through gluttony and self-indulgence. who destroyed marriages, friendships, and entire families on a whim, who ruled through fear, making execution a common political tool. And in the end, he was a man so physically broken that he could no longer hide the consequences of his own excesses. His decaying body betrayed him as surely as he had betrayed those closest to him. His coffin's gruesome explosion became the final fitting metaphor for a reign that couldn't even end without causing more horror. The parable of Henry VIII. History remembers kings for their victories, their reforms, or their legacies. Henry VIII is remembered for his wives, his break from Rome, and his role in shaping the English Reformation. But there's another lesson buried beneath the grandeur. Unchecked power can turn even a promising young ruler into something monstrous. His life and death are a reminder that history's heroes and villains are often the same person, seen from different angles, and that sometimes the most lasting image of a king is not his crown, but his coffin. In the next part, we'll turn back the clock and explore the intimate cruelty Henry inflicted on his wives in detail, beyond the headlines and schoolbook summaries, to understand why his domestic life was as dangerous as any battlefield. Henry VIII's reign is often remembered for one thing above all else: his 6 wives. It's a fact so famous that even people who know nothing else about Tudor history can recite the fateful rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But that sing-song line sanitizes a much darker truth. These were not simple breakups or tidy royal executions. They were acts of calculated humiliation, political engineering, and emotional torture, often playing out over months or years. Behind each wife's fate was a web of fear, manipulation, and cruelty that would be considered abuse by any modern standard. Catherine of Aragon, the loyal prisoner Henry's first, Queen Catherine of Aragon had been married to his older brother Arthur before becoming Henry's wife. For over 20 years, she fulfilled her role as queen with dignity. She stood by Henry through wars, miscarriages, and the birth of their only surviving child, Princess Mary. But when Catherine could no longer bear him a son, Henry became obsessed with replacing her. His reasoning wasn't just dynastic, it was personal. He convinced himself that marrying his brother's widow was cursed in the eyes of God, even though he had happily been married to her for 2 decades. When the Pope refused to grant an annulment, Henry broke with Rome and created the Church of England. Catherine was banished from court, stripped of her title, and forbidden from seeing Mary. She spent her last years in a drafty castle, writing letters to a husband who never read them. Rumors swirled that she was poisoned, but officially she died in 1536 of natural causes, alone and still signing herself Queen of England, until the end. Anne Boleyn, the Queen destroyed Anne Boleyn's story is often painted as the tale of an ambitious woman who rose too high and fell too far. But the reality was far uglier. Henry pursued her relentlessly for years, promising marriage if she would not become his mistress. When she finally became queen, she gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Henry's affection turned to suspicion, then to hatred. By 1536, Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George. The evidence was manufactured, extracted under torture, and based on hearsay. One of the accused, the court musician Mark Smeaton, was beaten until he confessed to an affair that likely never happened. Anne was forced to watch as all 5 men were executed, knowing she was next. On May 19, 1536, she faced the executioner's sword. She went to her death with dignity, proclaiming her innocence, but Henry wasted no time. Within 11 days, he had married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, the beloved who died conveniently. Jane Seymour is often portrayed as Henry's one true love. She gave him the son he craved, Edward, but died just 12 days after childbirth. Henry ordered her buried in the grandest style and later chose to be buried beside her. But Henry's supposed devotion had a pragmatic side. Jane's death spared her from the fate of his other wives, but it also allowed Henry to remarry without scandal. Within weeks of her funeral, he was negotiating his next marriage. Anne of Cleves, the survivor who played the game. Anne of Cleves was chosen for Henry through a political alliance. When she arrived in England, Henry took one look at her and decided she was unattractive, famously calling her a Flanders mare. The marriage was never consummated, and Henry sought an annulment almost immediately. Anne could have resisted, but she knew the fate of women who defied him. She agreed to the annulment on the grounds of non-consummation and publicly thanked Henry for treating her kindly, though privately she must have known the kindness was the mercy of still having her head. In exchange, she received a generous settlement, 2 estates, and the title, the King's beloved sister. She outlived all of Henry's other wives. Catherine Howard, the teen bride. Catherine Howard, barely in her late teens, became Henry's 5th wife when he was nearing 50, obese, and plagued by disease. She was vivacious, charming, and, unlike Henry, full of youthful energy. But her past came back to haunt her. When Henry learned she had been involved with other men before their marriage, he saw it as a personal betrayal. His rage was so great that he passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history. Catherine was accused of adultery during the marriage, an accusation that was likely true but hardly surprising given her husband's condition and cruelty. She was executed in 1542 at just 19 years old. Eyewitnesses said she was so terrified on the scaffold that she could barely speak. Catherine Parr, the one who survived Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, outlived him, but not without risk. Intelligent and pious, she acted as a nurse in his final years and helped reconcile him with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. But Catherine's interest in religious reform nearly got her killed. Conservative factions at court convinced Henry that she was a heretic. A warrant for her arrest was prepared. Catherine, realizing the danger, threw herself at Henry's mercy, claiming her discussions about religion were only meant to distract him from his pain. Whether Henry believed her or simply didn't want to bother with another execution so late in life, he forgave her. She stayed with him until his death in 1547, then quickly remarried. The pattern of control, looking at these 6 stories together, a clear pattern emerges. Henry's relationships were never about love. They were about power. His wives were political pawns, scapegoats for his frustrations, or tools for his legacy. When they could not give him what he wanted, they were disposed of, sometimes through annulment, sometimes through execution. Even those who escaped death, like Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, survived by appeasing him, playing the part of the grateful subordinate and never challenging his authority. Psychological terror, Henry's cruelty wasn't always physical. Much of it was psychological. He alternated between lavish affection and sudden hostility. He would shower a wife with gifts and praise one day, then refuse to see her the next. He publicly humiliated them, spread rumors about their fidelity, and manipulated the court to isolate them. This wasn't random, it was a calculated method of control. In Henry's court, isolation meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the king could shape events however he pleased. A dangerous game. For the women who married Henry VIII, survival wasn't guaranteed by beauty, wit, or obedience. It depended on reading his moods, pleasing his ego, and, most importantly, knowing when to disappear from the center of his attention. One wrong word could mean disgrace. One ill-timed pregnancy could mean execution. And yet, each of these women has left her mark on history, not just as victims of a tyrant, but as individuals who navigated one of the most dangerous courts in Europe. In the next part, we'll pull back from the personal tragedies and look at the day-to-day madness of Henry's court. His strange eating superstitions, his obsession with surveillance, and the culture of fear that turned England's palaces into gilded prisons. By the last decade of Henry VIII's reign, the Tudor court wasn't simply a political center, it was a fortress of fear. Every conversation could be overheard. Every gesture could be misinterpreted. One careless joke, one sideways glance, one moment of hesitation before obeying an order, and your head could be on the block within days. This wasn't paranoia in theory, it was paranoia in practice. Henry had turned the machinery of state into a surveillance system that would make modern dictators nod in approval. Spies spied on other spies. Nobles betrayed their own kin. Servants reported on their masters in the hope of a reward, only to find themselves accused later by another informant. The fortress king Henry's physical decline only heightened his fear of assassination. He no longer strode through the tilt yard in armor or rode at the head of his armies. He was too heavy, too sick, too slow. So instead, he fortified his personal security until his palaces began to feel less like royal residences and more like fortified compounds. He slept surrounded by armed guards, crossbows within reach, and daggers hidden under his pillows. His bedchamber wasn't just guarded from the outside, it had watchmen inside, standing at attention through the night as the king slept. Every palace he occupied had secret passages built into its walls, not for romance or intrigue, but for escape. Henry could vanish at a moment's notice if danger came. The locations of these passages were known only to a few trusted attendants, all of whom were also watched by spies. Seeing without being seen, Henry had peepholes installed in walls so he could observe people without their knowledge. Meeting rooms were fitted with primitive listening holes to eavesdrop on conversations. Courtiers never knew if they were being overheard, which kept everyone in a constant state of self-censorship. The result was a court where no one spoke freely. Flattery became a survival skill. People avoided discussing politics unless they were certain of loyalty, and in Henry's court, you could never be certain of anyone's loyalty. The poison panic. If there was one fear that dominated Henry's daily life, it was poison. In an age when assassination by poisoned food or drink was a genuine threat, Henry took precautions to the extreme. Every meal went through multiple tasters. Ingredients were tested individually: water, salt, spices, before being combined. Meals were prepared in sealed kitchens under armed guard, and once a dish was finished, it was covered and locked until it reached the king's table. And even then, Henry might refuse to eat if something felt wrong. A single suspicious glance from a servant could send an entire course back to the kitchen. He was so convinced of the danger that he sometimes forced tasters to wait a full half hour before he touched a bite, just in case the poison took time to work. Preemptive justice. Henry's paranoia didn't stop at security measures, it warped his legal system. The king began to arrest and execute people not for crimes they had committed, but for crimes they might commit. A dream, a rumor, or a vague suggestion could be enough to seal a man's fate. In some cases, the evidence was nothing more than an accusation from another courtier, who might have been acting out of jealousy or fear. The Tower of London swelled with prisoners whose treason was nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or speaking too freely within earshot of the wrong person. Family wasn't safe. Henry's suspicion extended even to his own children. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth were both closely monitored by agents who reported their movements and conversations to the king. He worried that his daughters might be used as figureheads for rebellion, especially since each had, at one time or another, been declared illegitimate. In Henry's mind, everyone was a potential traitor, including the people who shared his blood. The contagion of fear. Paranoia is contagious, and Henry's fear infected the court. Nobles began spying on each other, eager to prove loyalty by revealing plots against the king, real or imagined. Servants betrayed their masters. Friends avoided one another in public, lest someone accuse them of conspiring. Even the smallest gatherings were viewed with suspicion. The result was a poisonous atmosphere where survival depended on being invisible when trouble started, and on being loudly visible when loyalty needed to be demonstrated. Entertainment in a cage. Even court entertainments, banquets, tournaments, masks, were no escape from the tension. While musicians played and dancers twirled, eyes were always watching. One wrong step in the intricate dance of etiquette could be the end of you. A single misplaced compliment to the wrong noble could be interpreted as plotting. Applauding too enthusiastically for someone else's performance could be seen as favoring a rival faction. This wasn't just politics, it was psychological warfare, and Henry was the puppet master. The cost of speaking truth. No one dared to tell Henry what he didn't want to hear. His physicians avoided giving bad news, his ministers couched every suggestion in flattery, and his courtiers learned to praise even his most irrational ideas. The result was a feedback loop. Henry, hearing only what he wanted to hear, became more convinced of his own infallibility. And anyone who tried to break that illusion risked their life. By the end, Henry VIII was both the most feared man in England and one of its most isolated. The fortress he built around himself, physical and psychological, was impenetrable. But it was also a prison. The king in his gilded cage, Henry's court, was a reflection of his own mind, rich, powerful, and utterly suffocated by suspicion. For those who lived and worked within its walls, survival meant constant calculation: what to say, what to hide, who to trust, and when to disappear from view. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when that fortress finally crumbled, not just in the weeks before Henry's death, but in the grotesque spectacle of his body's collapse and the chaos it unleashed after the king took his last breath. When death finally came for Henry VIII in January 1547, it didn't arrive like a quiet shadow. It came like a slow-moving catastrophe. The final months of his life were a grim spectacle, a living prelude to one of the most grotesque royal deaths in English history. The king, who had once been the athletic golden boy of Europe, was now so bloated and crippled that he couldn't walk unaided. His face was puffy, his breathing labored, and the smell of his body, especially his ulcerated legs, was overwhelming. Even his most loyal attendants struggled to remain in the same room for long. The unspoken truth. Everyone knew the king was dying, but in Henry's court, speaking the truth was dangerous. To openly declare that the monarch's end was near could be considered treason. The royal physicians performed an elaborate charade, pretending that his recovery was possible even as they treated symptoms that screamed otherwise. Henry himself avoided the subject. He still issued commands, signed orders, and entertained envoys. Plans for feasts, marriages, and political maneuvers continued as if time were not running out. The last confession, that never came by custom, a dying king was expected to make his confession and receive last rites. But Henry's towering pride stood in the way. He had built his entire identity on the notion that he was God's chosen ruler. How could such a man admit weakness at the end? It wasn't until the very last hours that Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to his bedside. By then, Henry was slipping in and out of consciousness. Cranmer is said to have urged him to put his trust in Christ. The only reply was a faint squeeze of the hand. Moments later, the king was gone. The problem of the body. In life, Henry's bulk was a symbol of power. In death, it became a logistical nightmare. His enormous frame required a specially built coffin, lined with lead to try to contain the odor and slow decomposition. Multiple layers of wood encased the body, and the corpse itself was wrapped in lead sheets. But there was no hiding what had happened to the man inside. Years of disease, infection, and excess had taken their toll. The body was swollen, the skin tight and shiny. The leg ulcers were still open and foul-smelling. Even the act of moving him risked pieces of necrotic flesh breaking loose. The exploding coffin. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle was meant to be a display of solemn grandeur. Instead, it became infamous for one of the most morbid incidents in royal history. As the cortege made its slow journey, the gases building inside Henry's body from decomposition reached critical pressure. The reinforced lead coffin could contain it no longer. Somewhere along the route, the coffin split and burst. The smell that poured out was so overpowering that the procession had to halt. According to some accounts, fluid from the king's body seeped onto the road. Chroniclers, never ones to resist the dramatic, claimed that dogs lapped at the liquid, a macabre image seized on by later moralists as poetic justice for a king they saw as tyrannical. Trouble at the grave. Even burial wasn't straightforward. Henry was to be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the wife he claimed to have loved most. But the weight of the coffin, with all its lead lining, was so great that the grave had to be widened and reinforced. When they finally lowered him in, the ground began to collapse under the strain. Gravediggers worked frantically to stabilize the site, and it reportedly took multiple attempts to ensure the coffin stayed put. After the burial, there were whispers of strange sounds and smells coming from the tomb. Most likely more gases escaping, but in the superstitious Tudor world, many believed it was the restless spirit of the king, unable to find peace. The servants who paid the price. Several attendants who handled Henry's corpse fell ill soon after, with some dying within weeks. In an age before germ theory, no one understood the cause, but the connection was noted. Whether it was due to infection from the decomposing body or coincidence, the story only added to the legend of a cursed king whose presence was dangerous even in death. The kingdom without the king. Henry's death left England in a precarious position. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, was too young to rule alone, and power immediately fell to a council of regents. The rivalries and factionalism that Henry had fostered in life didn't die with him. They intensified. His paranoia had so poisoned the court that trust was almost impossible to find. Even those who had been allies in keeping the king's favor now turned on each other, jostling for influence over the young king. The shadow of his reign. For all the pomp of the Tudor age, Henry VIII's death was a stark reminder of how power can corrupt the body and soul alike. His policies had reshaped religion, crushed dissent, and altered the course of English history, but his personal legacy was one of fear, cruelty, and excess. The grotesque details of his final days and funeral became part of that legacy. Chroniclers, moralists, and later historians would dwell on them, sometimes with ghoulish fascination, sometimes with moral outrage. Even today, the image of his coffin bursting mid-procession lingers as a macabre symbol of a reign that could not end quietly. The death that fit the life in the end, Henry VIII's death was perfectly in character. Dramatic, disruptive, and leaving behind a mess for others to clean up. The king who had demanded absolute control over his kingdom left this world in a way that no one could control. The kingdom moved on, but the shadow of the man, bloated, suspicious, and terrifying, never fully faded. His ghost may or may not haunt Windsor Castle, but in the pages of history, his presence still looms. In the final part, we'll step back and take in the full picture of Henry VIII's legacy. Not just the political and religious shifts he set in motion, but the human cost of his reign and why his story still fascinates and horrifies us centuries later. Henry VIII's reign ended in 1547, but the shadow he cast has stretched across nearly 5 centuries. He is remembered as a king who changed England forever, splitting from Rome, seizing church wealth, reshaping the monarchy's power, and fathering a line of rulers whose reigns defined an era. But behind the political and religious legacy lies another story. A human cost so high and a personal descent so grotesque that it transforms Henry's tale from one of grandeur into a cautionary epic. His life wasn't just about power, it was about the way absolute power can warp a person beyond recognition. The political earthquake. On the world stage, Henry VIII's most famous act was his break with the Catholic Church. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry defied Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and set in motion the English Reformation. This wasn't just a religious shift, it was a political revolution. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth and lands seized by the crown. Religious authority became a tool of royal control. The structure of England's governance changed permanently, laying the groundwork for centuries of tension between church and state. Yet, while historians debate the theological motives, it's clear that for Henry, much of this upheaval began with a personal desire: the need for a male heir and the unwillingness to be told no. A dynasty built on fear. Henry's obsession with securing the Tudor line drove much of his domestic policy and much of his personal cruelty. His 6 marriages, his willingness to execute wives, friends, and advisors alike, and his treatment of his own daughters, all stemmed from an anxiety that his dynasty could collapse without a strong male successor. Ironically, it was his daughter Elizabeth who would become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling for 45 years and ushering in a golden age. But in Henry's lifetime, the idea of a woman on the throne was, to him, a political nightmare. This fear of instability fueled his paranoia, which in turn created a court culture where no one could be certain of survival. Ministers like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, once trusted allies, ended up on the executioner's block when they ceased to be useful or dared to oppose him. The Court of the Damned Henry's reign is a study in how fear can become a governing principle. His court was both a stage and a trap, glittering banquets, lavish tournaments, and grand entertainments masking a constant undercurrent of danger. Loyalty wasn't rewarded with safety. If anything, the closer you were to Henry, the greater the risk. He could and did turn on anyone. Titles, lands, and privileges could be stripped away overnight. A jest made in the wrong company could lead to arrest. A political misstep could lead to the scaffold. And yet, courtiers flocked to him. The wealth and influence he could grant were irresistible. The danger was part of the allure. The human toll. The tally of lives lost directly or indirectly because of Henry VIII is staggering. 2 wives, countless nobles, clergy and commoners executed on charges ranging from treason to heresy to imagined conspiracies. The dissolution of the monasteries displaced thousands of monks, nuns and lay workers. The destruction of religious institutions also meant the loss of hospitals, schools and centers of charity that had served communities for centuries. And then there were the psychological scars on his surviving wives, his children, and the generations of courtiers who learned to navigate a political landscape where danger could come from the very man they served. The body as a symbol. In his youth, Henry's athletic, handsome appearance embodied Tudor strength and promise. By the end, his decaying body mirrored the moral decay of his reign. His obesity, festering wounds, and reliance on mechanical aids to move were more than just health issues. They became symbols of indulgence, corruption, and the cost of unchecked authority. The grotesque details of his final years, his inability to walk, his dependence on portable toilets, the overwhelming stench, were whispered about in his own time and gleefully recorded by later generations. His death, complete with the infamous coffin explosion, became a kind of grim parable. No matter how powerful you are, the body has the last word. The myth and the man. Part of Henry's enduring fascination is the contrast between the myth and the reality. The myth, carefully cultivated during his reign and polished in later centuries, presents him as a strong, decisive ruler, a master of politics and war, a man who bent nations to his will. The reality is more complicated, a man driven by insecurity, whose personal desires often outweighed the good of his realm, and whose reign left as much chaos as it did reform. Even his famous charisma, so evident in his youth, became a weapon, used to charm allies before discarding them, to woo wives before destroying them. Why we still care. 5 centuries later, Henry VIII remains one of history's most recognizable figures. His story has everything: love affairs, betrayals, political intrigue, religious upheaval, personal tragedy, and a descent into physical and moral ruin. We care about Henry because his life feels almost fictional. Too dramatic, too extreme, too perfectly shaped for a story. And yet, it's all true. The Tudor chroniclers recorded it. The state papers confirm it. The monuments to his reign still stand. We also care because his flaws are deeply human. Strip away the crown, and Henry's life is about desires we all recognize: love, legacy, control, the fear of being forgotten. But magnify those desires with absolute power, and you get a cautionary tale on a scale few can match. The final judgment. Was Henry VIII a great king? That depends on what you value. He strengthened the monarchy, expanded the navy, and made England more independent from foreign influence. Those are lasting achievements. But he also ruled through fear, destroyed lives without remorse, and left a legacy of instability that his children would have to navigate for decades. His reign offers a lesson that resonates far beyond Tudor England. Power without limits does not make a ruler strong, it makes them dangerous. The monster behind the crown. In the end, Henry VIII's story is not just about the wives, the politics, or the wars. It's about a man who let his appetites, whether for food, women, or power, consume him until they destroyed his body, his relationships, and, arguably, the stability of his realm. It's about a court that mirrored its ruler, dazzling on the surface, rotten underneath. It's about a death that was as chaotic and grotesque as the life that preceded it. And it's about the enduring truth that history's most powerful figures are still human, capable of brilliance, cruelty, and collapse in equal measure. If you've made it this far, you've seen Henry VIII as few schoolbooks dare to show him, not just as a king, but as a cautionary tale. And if you think this was dark, remember, history is full of rulers whose secrets are even stranger, bloodier, and more disturbing. So subscribe and we'll keep digging them up.